Welcome to our discussion on the results of World War II. As we looked at the causes of World War II, which were the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression, fierce nationalism, and appeasement, we see that war happening, and then we see what happens as a result of those ideologies and events after the war. So you have a paper that's listed short-term results, long-term results. We're going to briefly discuss these. You don't need to put down too much information now. You can add to that chart in class later as we're going to be discussing it again. But let's get the main ideas down before you come. First of all, we're going to be looking at the dates that the war ended. VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day, happened on May 7th, 1945. VJ Day, the war ending in Japan, happened in August 14th, 1945. Write those two dates at the top of the chart. That's the war was officially over, and then post-war starts to happen, and all of these results start coming out. Okay, our first one is we always look at the actual numbers, the actual numbers of how many people died in the war. So let's look at the casualty list for the war casualties, and that would be your first point on short term, of course. So the actual number of people that died missing, wounded is estimated between 50 and 60 million people. 50 and 60 million people. That is an amazing amount of people. It blows your mind, and it certainly was the largest war in terms of destruction of property and lives in the history of the world. So let's go to the second casualty list. This is a separate casualty list because this is not counted in the war, actual people fighting in the war, and that's the Holocaust. So put Holocaust for the second result, or Holocaust casualties. The idea of the fierce nationalism we talked about brought about the death of more than 10 million people through Japanese and Germany extermination of people that they hated. We're going to that number of the Holocaust in Europe is around 10 million plus people, and that's the top population of Arizona right now and New Mexico combined. It is a staggering amount of people as well, and that's like 1/5 of the people fighting in the war. There's another that same amount killed in the Holocaust. So we're going to put Holocaust casualties as our second, and we'll be looking at that more in class, like I said. The third result is called war crimes trials. Many of you may not be aware of the fact that after the war, the Allied powers wanted to punish, and they wanted by law to bring these people to trial and have them be punished for their crimes against humanity. Before the war between World War I and World War II, we had a world court system. We had conferences where people and nations had agreed, both Japan and Germany had at different conferences, to treat people humanely and correctly in war situations. Both of these groups completely defied that, and they were able to be brought legally to trial. It was both the international and domestic courts. That means like international groups and also people within a country were bringing these people to trial. We had people tried. Some were found, almost all were found guilty. Some were executed, and some were imprisoned. Unfortunately, many perpetrators got away with it. They actually went and nothing happened. They went and lived normal lives after World War II and never were brought to punishment for the things that they had done during the war. And remember, when we were at the Holocaust Museum, they were still looking. Some of the Jews are still looking for these people to try to bring them to trial. Pretty soon that's going to end. Most of these people have passed away. So third was war crimes trials. We'll show you some pictures of that when we get back to school on Wednesday. The fourth is called the Allied occupation of Germany and Japan. Allied, or you could just put Allied occupations. Okay. Once. I don't know if you know this, that Germany was broken up into 4 separate parts and controlled by obviously they no longer had a government. So the government had fallen, and the Allies were setting up new governments. The USSR got a chunk, Britain got a chunk to oversee, France got a chunk, and America got a chunk. We'll see a map of that. This is when eventually East and Western Germany will become two separate nations, one communist and one free. And that lasted for over 40 years, a lot more than 40 years, I believe. Then Japan was also divided up between China, the USSR, the UK, and the United States. China, instead of France, was the fourth person there, fourth nation. However, the USSR was not allowed a lot of influence. Things were starting to really have friction between the United States and the USSR. So actually, the biggest influence in Japan was America, and how they transformed Japan from a dictatorship to a free nation that they still are today. And Germany on the west side was also transformed into a free democratic country. The occupation in Japan ended in 1952. I'm not really sure the date of when Germany was allowed to control itself. We'll talk about that in class. So Allied occupations mean that Americans were going to go in, Britons, all the other groups that I told you, and they were going to try to not have happened what happened after World War I. Those countries were allowed to go back to whatever they were doing. This time that wasn't going to happen. We were going to make sure that another war did not happen. But rather than punish the people, they were trying to help them. And you'll note that two of America's strongest allies has been Germany and Japan. That's an amazing thing, and that's as a result of how they were treated after World War II. So the idea of retribution that happened in the Versailles Treaty, we rejected that. And it's another reason we didn't immediately have another war with those same countries. And they were instead ended up being grateful for what was done for them. And that brings us to the next point, which is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a United States only plan to help Europe, especially after the war. Remember, we talked about how terrible the cities. Most of the major cities in Germany were completely wiped out. France as well. And so the Americans got together. It's called Marshall for George Marshall, who was head of the State Department at that point. He came up with a plan to help these people. We aided only Western Europe because Eastern Europe was now under the control of the Soviets, and we'll talk more about that later because that's another a result of the war. But let's talk about the Marshall Plan. It was $12 billion, which is a lot of money back in 1945, was given to Europe to rebuild their cities and their economies, and it worked. Europe has had, after the war, had a robust economy in Western Europe, and it was wildly successful, for which the Europe was very, very grateful to the Americans for helping them rebuild their cities and their economies. So Marshall Plan, the last result of the short-term results is the Eastern Europe becomes communist. So again, we have a map redrawing at the end of the war. We had a huge map redrawing at the end of World War I. We have the map redrawn mostly only in the eastern countries of Europe. So we've got Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Albania, all coming under control of the USSR. This happened over a period of 5 to 10 years as the war was ending. After the war, and so the military and economic superiority was totally extended to these countries. They would have dictators that were told what to do by the USSR, and this was part of the deal that Roosevelt and Stalin put together at the Warsaw Pact, and it was a terrible thing. This was a very negative result of World War II, where we had promised Stalin that he could take over these areas, and the lives of these people did not go well after World War II, unlike in Western Europe where it was rebuilt. It is a very sad part of the story. So that leads us to some of the long-term results. So let's review all of these, the 6 short-term. War casualties, Holocaust casualties, war crimes trials, Allied occupations of Germany and Japan, the Marshall Plan, and the map of Eastern Europe redrawn, or control of the Eastern Bloc nations by the USSR. So let's go to the 3 long-term results. These are very short because your whole next unit the next 2 units are going to be involved in just describing these long-term results. So let's just write these 3 things down. The Cold War obviously would be the first big result of World War II. You have only 2 superpowers at the end of World War II. After World War I, America had risen to a world power, but at the end of World War II, there's nothing left for any countries to have any kind of influence or money other than the USSR and the USSA. By Cold War, we mean that during this period of the Cold War, these 2 nations never fought hand-to-hand combat, Americans versus Russians, or the people from the USSR, but there were a lot of world conflicts that happened as a result, and that's what you're going to be doing your report on when we get to the Cold War. The second one, we've got Cold War, number 1. 2, the United Nations, which was started in October 1945. Delegates from 51 nations met in San Francisco, and they had 4 purposes. They were going to maintain world peace and security. They were going to develop relations between the nations. They were going to foster cooperation to solve economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian international problems. You don't have to write all that down. Just write United Nations. We're going to look and see, were they successful or were they unsuccessful as the years passed? Right now, I don't know if you know, there's a call to just get rid of the United Nations by many people in America. I don't know if that'll happen or not, but it's an interesting development. So has it reached the end of its abilities to do anything? We'll talk about that. So second, United Nations. The last one, and our next unit will be all about this, is the establishment of Israel as a nation. You can just put establishment of Israel. For the first time since BC 586, a nation of Israel exists. That's a lot of years. That's 2,000 almost, to be exact. So that is an amazing, miraculous, God-given result. This is a result of a reaction to the Holocaust. Many countries felt that tremendous guilt over what had happened to Israel. We had basically kind of pretended it didn't happen before we knew it was happening, and then after the war was over and the Holocaust was revealed, the world, for the first time ever maybe in the history of Israel, felt badly about Israel and wanted to help. So the newly formed United Nations created a Jewish nation called Israel in the area of Palestine. There was no country there before. I think it's very important that you know that when they established Israel, there were no formal countries with governments established. There were just groups of people. There were some Jews around. There were Palestinians around. There were Arabs around. So by establishing a nation there, they weren't doing anything against another nation. So that was one of the reasons they felt that they were able to do that. So in 1948, the United Nations voted to create Israel in the area of Palestine. That brings us to an end of this discussion. Print out those, bring them to school with you on Wednesday, and I hope everything's going well. I love you guys, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.